The world had been reduced to three things: the frantic, squeegeeing rhythm of my truck's windshield wipers, the blinding glare of my own headlights reflecting off a sheet of aluminum, and the smug, water-slicked smirk of Brenda Fromm. Rain hammered the roof of the F-150 with the intensity of 1,000 tiny drummers on speed. The wind, a real banshee of a thing, howled through the meticulously planned, beige and taupe canyons of Serenity Cove, my own personal slice of suburban purgatory. In my rearview mirror, the boat I'd poured my soul and severance into, the Albatross, sat hitched and ready, a 24-foot monument to my very bad decision-making. In front of me, the gate was down. The only gate. The only way out. And looped through its bars was a thick, greasy chain secured by an industrial-grade padlock that looked like it could anchor a battleship. Brenda stood under the meager protection of the keypad overhang, wrapped in a yellow rain slicker so large it looked like she'd skinned a school bus. The beam of my headlights caught the triumphant glint in her eyes. This wasn't about safety. This was about victory. Her victory. I rolled down the window, and the storm immediately tried to invade my truck. "Brenda!" I yelled, my voice barely carrying over the roar. "What the hell is this? It's not 10 o'clock yet." She took a delicate step forward, her smirk somehow widening. "The timeline was accelerated due to the worsening conditions," she shouted back, her voice crisp and condescending even in a gale. "The gate is secure for the night for everyone's safety. See you at 8 a.m., Alexander." She paused, letting her gaze drift pointedly to the beautiful, half-restored vessel tethered to my bumper. "If you've removed your lawn ornament by then?" And with a final, withering glare that could curdle milk from 50 paces, she turned and marched off into the shrieking darkness of Hurricane Ophelia, swallowed by the very storm she was using as a weapon. I was left alone, staring at the locked gate. Trapped. "Well, hell," I muttered, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the roof. "Checkmate, you magnificent psychopath." It had all started so peacefully, of course. Tyranny rarely announces itself with a thunderclap. It creeps in with the whisper of new regulations and the rustle of a clipboard. 36 hours earlier, the sun was shining, the air was thick with that lazy Florida humidity, and the only storm on my horizon was the cloud of fine mahogany dust rising from my orbital sander. I was in my driveway, hunched over a piece of trim, in a state of pure, unadulterated bliss. Getting laid off from a tech job where my primary function was to optimize button placement on an app that sold artisanal dog sweaters had been, unexpectedly, the best thing to ever happen to me. It gave me two things: a severance package that wasn't quite buy an island money, but was definitely don't work for a year money, and the freedom to finally tackle the dream I'd been harboring since I was a kid. That dream was currently sitting on a trailer on my side lawn, much to the neighborhood's chagrin. The Albatross, a 1986 Seabreeze 240, a classic cabin cruiser with lines that could make a grown man weep. Sure, when I bought her, she was a wreck of peeling gel coat, sun-rotted vinyl, and an engine that sounded like a bag of wrenches in a dryer. But I saw the potential. For 6 months, I'd been pouring every waking hour into her. I'd rebuilt the engine, rewired the electronics, and was now in the final meditative stage, sanding and varnishing the original mahogany brightwork. My home, Serenity Cove, was less a neighborhood and more a social experiment in enforced conformity. It was 50 shades of beige, a place where the bylaws were thicker than the phone book, and the height of your grass was infinitely more important than the content of your character. It was quiet, clean, and soulless, and it was run with an iron fist by its duly elected HOA president, Brenda Fromm. Just as I was admiring the smooth grain of the wood, a shadow fell over me. I didn't even need to look up. The scent of lavender and simmering rage preceded her. "Alexander," I sighed, switching off the sander. "Brenda." She didn't walk. She surveyed her domain. Today she was armed with her usual weapon of choice, a clipboard, which she clutched like a holy text. "Still tinkering with your vessel?" The way she said vessel made it sound like I was assembling a dirty bomb on my lawn. "It's a boat, Brenda," I said, wiping dust from my hands. "And yes, it's a process. A beautiful, time-honored process. The bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph C, are quite clear about prolonged outdoor storage of non-operational watercraft." She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on her clipboard. "I've already issued you 2 written warnings. This is your 3rd and final verbal notice. It's not non-operational, it's pre-operational. Big difference," I argued, trying to keep my tone light. "The engine runs like a dream. I fired it up last Tuesday. Scared the hell out of Mrs. Henderson's poodle, but it purrs. I just need to finish the bright work." Her eyes narrowed. To Brenda, the distinction between non-operational and pre-operational was the kind of semantic nonsense that anarchists use to justify their lifestyles. My boat, my beautiful albatross, was an unsightly blight on her perfectly curated landscape. It was a visible sign of nonconformity, and she would not stand for it. Before she could issue her next decree, a flurry of motion came from next door. It was Dave, my neighbor, a man who lived in a perpetual state of low-grade panic. He was waving his phone like it was on fire. "Alex! Alex, did you see the news?" he panted, his face pale. "Hurricane Ophelia just got upgraded to a Category 3. They're saying it might swing our way." I felt a familiar knot of dread that came with living on the Gulf Coast. Brenda, however, merely sniffed disdainfully, as if the National Weather Service was just another unruly resident challenging her authority. "The HOA Emergency Preparedness Committee is monitoring the situation," she declared, her voice radiating an unnerving calm. "We have protocols. There's no need for widespread panic." She shot one final, withering glare at my boat, made a sharp, decisive note on her clipboard, and marched away. I watched her go, a tiny, khaki-clad dictator on a mission. Dave looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. "Protocols? What protocols?" I dusted off the mahogany trim. "I don't know, Dave," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "But I bet her protocol for a shark attack is to issue the shark a violation for swimming without a laminated resident ID." 24 hours later, the mood had shifted from mild concern to frantic, full-blown preparation. The news was a constant, ominous loop of weather maps, reporters in flapping raincoats, and dire warnings. Hurricane Ophelia was no longer a might, it was a when. A mandatory evacuation order had been issued for all coastal communities, our little slice of beige hell included. The deadline was tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp. I spent the day in a flurry of activity, wrestling with sheets of plywood to board up my windows and securing everything loose in the yard. Next door, Dave's prep was significantly more chaotic. He looked like he was trying to pack his entire 3-bedroom house into the back of a mid-size sedan. I saw him attempting to stuff a standing lamp and what appeared to be a decorative ceramic rooster into his trunk. "You're not going to need the rooster, Dave," I yelled over. "It's an heirloom," he shouted back, his voice tight with stress. "It's got sentimental value." Just as I was contemplating the sentimental value of poultry-themed decor, my phone dinged with an email notification. The subject line, in all caps, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the wind picking up. "Urgent, Serenity Cove Evacuation Protocol Update." It was from Brenda, of course it was. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," I said aloud. Dave, having given up on the rooster, scurried over. "What is it? Is it about the trash cans?" She sent an email last year saying we'd be fined if we put the cans out too early before a storm. It's worse, Dave, so much worse. I held up the phone and read from the screen, my voice dripping with disbelief. Dear residents of Serenity Cove, in light of the mandatory evacuation order and to prevent potential looting from outside elements during the interim period, the HOA Executive Committee has enacted Emergency Bylaw 17.3. To ensure an orderly and safe departure, the main community entrance gate will be secured and locked at 10 p.m. tonight. Dave's jaw dropped. Tonight? I kept reading. The gate will be officially reopened at precisely 8 a.m. tomorrow, at which time I will personally oversee the phased and orderly exodus of our community. We thank you for your cooperation in these trying times. Stay safe and stay serene. Brenda Fromm, President, Serenity Cove, HOA. I lowered the phone. The two of us stood there in the whipping wind, dumbfounded. She can't do that, Dave finally sputtered, his voice cracking. That's insane. That's illegal, right? What if there's an emergency tonight? What if the storm surges early? I scoffed, shaking my head. It was so perfectly, so diabolically Brenda. This wasn't about looting. This was about power. This was her chance to play God, to be the benevolent queen directing her subjects when and how they were allowed to flee for their lives. Dave, this is Brenda, I said, a dark resolve hardening in my gut. She'd issue a parking ticket to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for blocking a fire lane. This is about control. She wants to be the one to literally open the floodgates. But I wasn't playing her game. No way. My plan formed instantly, simple and defiant. I was getting out tonight. I'd pack my truck with the essentials, hitch up the albatross. There was no way in hell I was leaving my biggest and most valuable asset to be crushed by an oak tree. And I'd be on the interstate, heading for the sweet, high ground of Central Florida long before her 10 p.m. deadline. Are you sure that's a good idea? Dave asked, wringing his hands. She'll be furious. Let her be furious, I said, already striding toward my truck. I'll send her a postcard from Orlando. The next few hours were a blur of frenzied packing. I threw a duffel bag of clothes, my laptop, a case of water, and a box of protein bars into the cab of the truck. Then came the hard part, hitching the boat trailer in the rapidly deteriorating weather. The wind was a physical force now, shoving and pulling at me as I wrestled with the heavy-duty hitch. Finally, with a satisfying clank, the albatross was secure. At 9:45 p.m., I was ready. The rain was coming down in thick, slanting sheets. I gave a final wave to Dave, who was watching from his doorway with the terrified look of a man who had chosen to obey the psycho-dictator. I climbed into my truck, turned the key, and rumbled toward the front of the neighborhood. Toward freedom. Which is how I ended up here. Staring at a locked gate, a heavy chain, and the smug, triumphant face of a woman who had outmaneuvered me. It wasn't just about the rules anymore. Her pointed comment about my lawn ornament made it crystal clear. This was personal. This was punishment. This was war. My first instinct was primal, ram the gate. My F-150 was a beast, and the gate was just aluminum. I could probably shear it right off its hinges. Then I pictured the fallout. The thousands in damages. The inevitable lawsuit from the HOA that Brenda would pursue with the religious fervor of a zealot. And the very real possibility of getting my truck and boat hopelessly tangled in the wreckage just as a hurricane was making landfall. I let the fantasy go with a sigh. Plan B was to use logic and reason. A fool's errand, I knew, but one I had to attempt. I tried calling her. The call went straight to voicemail, her recorded voice a smooth, infuriating caress of condescension. You've reached Brenda Fromm. I'm currently unavailable. Please leave a detailed message, and I will respond at my earliest convenience." I left a message that was, shall we say, less than detailed, and more of a string of creative, storm-themed curses. So, on to Plan C, involving a higher authority. I pulled out my phone, fingers fumbling on the wet screen, and dialed 911. The dispatcher who answered sounded profoundly bored, as if my call was interrupting a particularly good nap. "911, what's your emergency?" "Hi, yes, my name is Alex. I'm trapped in my housing development. The HOA president has locked the only gate, and there's a mandatory evacuation order for a Category 3 hurricane that's about to hit us." There was a long pause. "Sir." "She locked the gate?" "Yes, with a chain and a padlock, on purpose." "Is your life in immediate danger, sir?" the dispatcher asked, her tone suggesting that immediate meant actively on fire. "Well, not this exact second, but there is a giant swirling vortex of death and destruction on its way, so I'd say the danger is pretty damn imminent." A sigh. "This isn't a life-threatening emergency, sir. I'm transferring you to the non-emergency line." Before I could protest, I was on hold, subjected to a tinny, instrumental version of a Kenny G song that was somehow more offensive than the hurricane. 10 agonizing minutes later, a new voice, equally unenthusiastic, came on the line. I explained the entire situation again. The level of confusion on the other end was palpable. "So, your HOA president locked the community gate early?" "Yes, trapping dozens of residents inside during a state of emergency evacuation." To my surprise, they actually sent a car. 30 minutes after my call, a police cruiser, its lights painting lazy blue and red circles in the rain, pulled up behind my truck. 2 officers emerged, their raincoats glistening. One was older, with a thick mustache, and the weary eyes of a man who had seen the absolute dumbest aspects of humanity. The other was younger, greener, with a look of mild curiosity. Miller and Davis. I got out of my truck and laid out the facts for a third time, my voice getting increasingly shrill. I showed them the official evacuation order on my phone. I showed them Brenda's unhinged email. I pointed emphatically at the very real, very locked gate. Officer Miller sighed, a deep, profound sound that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 petty disputes. "Sir, I understand your frustration. I really do," he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. "But the gate is on private property. This is an HOA matter. Technically, it's a civil dispute." I felt my sanity begin to fray. "A civil dispute?" I screeched, my voice cracking. "There's a Category 3 hurricane about 5 hours from here. That's not a civil dispute. That's reckless endangerment. That's false imprisonment, kidnapping. That's a whole bunch of really bad things." Officer Davis, the younger one, tried to be helpful. "Did you try calling her again?" "She's not answering," I said, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "Her phone probably doesn't accept calls from people who use contractions or have a soul." To their credit, they made the effort. They drove their cruiser down the block to Brenda's 2-story beige palace. They walked up to her door and knocked. They knocked again, louder this time. I watched from the gate as the hollow sound was swallowed by the wind. No answer. Of course there was no answer. She was probably in her bunker, gloating over a cup of chamomile tea. They returned to me, their shoulders slumped in defeat. "Our hands are tied, sir," Miller said, shaking his head. "We can't force entry without a warrant, and no judge is signing a warrant for an HOA squabble at 10 o'clock at night, hurricane or not. It's her property." "So that's it? We're just stuck here?" "Our official advice, sir," Miller concluded, his face grim, "is to go home, hunker down, and wait for the gate to open at 8 a.m. It's the safest thing to do." As if on cue, a biblical gust of wind tore through the neighborhood. It ripped a string of decorative plastic flamingos from Dave's lawn, a flagrant violation of Bylaw 8.6, lawn ornamentation avian-themed, and sent them cartwheeling down the street like demented pink harbingers of the apocalypse. One of them smacked squarely into the side of the police cruiser with a dull thud. The cops shared a look, then got back in their car and drove away, leaving me alone again, defeated. The official channels had failed. The system had failed. I was on my own. With a heavy heart, I put my truck in reverse and slowly, painstakingly, backed my truck and my beautiful, useless boat back into my driveway as the rain became torrential. The hours between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. were a blur of wind, rain, and rising despair. I sat in my living room, listening to the house groan under the assault of Ophelia's outer bands. Then, at precisely 2:07 a.m., the world went dark. The power was out. The only light was the frantic beam of my flashlight, and the only sound was the constant, deafening roar of the storm. My phone, which I'd been smart enough to connect to a battery pack, buzzed to life. It was Dave. His voice was a high-pitched squeak of pure terror. "Alex, the canal! Look at the canal!" My house, like most in Serenity Cove, backed onto one of the decorative, man-made canals that snaked through the development and eventually connected to the intracoastal waterway. They were usually placid, slightly murky ribbons of water, home to a few turtles and the occasional brave mullet. I scrambled to my back window, pointing my flashlight into the churning darkness. My blood ran cold. The water, normally a good 10 feet below the brand-new dock I'd had installed, was now only a foot or two from the top. It was moving with a terrifying speed, a muddy, debris-choked torrent. The storm surge was here, pushing a mountain of seawater from the Gulf back into our little canal system. "The roads are going to flood," I said into the phone, a dawning horror creeping into my voice. "The gate won't matter if the entire neighborhood is underwater." "We're going to die!" Dave wailed, his voice dissolving into sobs. "We're all going to die, and it's her fault! She's killed us all!" His panic was contagious, but as I stared at the rising, angry water, a different thought, a wild and insane spark of an idea began to form in my mind. Brenda had locked the road. She had taken away the obvious, civilized method of escape, but in doing so, she'd overlooked the other way out. The road is the problem, I thought, but the water is a solution. My eyes darted to the side of my house, where the albatross sat on its trailer, looking more like a beached whale than a seafaring vessel. My escape route wasn't a road, it was a waterway. The rapidly rising canal was no longer just a threat, it was an opportunity. I just had to get my boat from my lawn into that water. The idea was patently insane. Moving a 3,000-pound boat in the dark, in the middle of a hurricane, was a recipe for disaster. But it was better than the alternative, which was sitting here and waiting to see if my living room would become a new extension of the Gulf of Mexico. But I couldn't do it alone. The logistics were impossible. Then I remembered Juan. Juan was the head of the marine construction company that had built my dock. He was a master of his craft, a no-nonsense guy who spoke in clipped, efficient sentences and had forgotten more about moving heavy objects near water than I would ever know. I scrolled frantically through my phone, praying I had enough service. 1 bar. It would have to do. I pressed the call button. It was 2:30 a.m. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" Juan's voice was thick with sleep. "Juan, it's Alex Peterson from Serenity Cove," I shouted over the wind. "I have a crazy, time-sensitive, possibly life-or-death question for you." That got his attention. "What's wrong?" he said, suddenly wide awake. "Is the dock okay? Those pilings are rated for a Cat 4. "The dock is great, too great. It's about to be a submarine base. Listen, the HOA president locked us all in, and the streets are about to flood. I need to get my boat in the water right now. From my lawn. How did you guys get that mini excavator in my backyard when you built the dock? There was a pause. I could hear him processing the sheer stupidity of my situation. The excavator. We used a set of heavy-duty inflatable rollers and a winch. The ground was too soft for the tires. Do you still have them? I asked, my heart pounding. No, Wait, he said. My foreman was complaining last week. We were missing 2 of the big ones, the 10-footers. Said they were a pain to haul out and he'd get them later. Check under your deck, by the pilings. They might still be there. It was a long shot, but it was a shot. Okay, one more question, Juan. Is this canal deep enough? Like, really deep enough? Can I actually get out to the intracoastal from here? I heard a dry chuckle on the other end of the line. Hombre, I dug that canal myself for the developer 10 years ago. They wanted it 6 feet deep. I made it 10. Always over-engineer, you know? You have more than enough water to get out. Just watch for the submerged mailboxes. I could have kissed him. Juan, you're a lifesaver. I owe you big time. Just don't sink your boat, man, he said, and hung up. I clicked off the phone, a manic, borderline unhinged grin spreading across my face. I had a plan. It was stupid. It was dangerous. It was almost certainly going to destroy my lawn and violate at least 17 different HOA bylaws. But it was a plan. I grabbed my headlamp, pulled on my boots, and looked out the window at my boat, sitting there in the howling darkness. All right, Albatross, I said, my voice filled with a giddy, terrifying resolve. Time to fly. The next hour was a symphony of grunting, slipping, and creative cursing that would have made a sailor blush. Clad in my useless raincoat and guided by the bobbing beam of my headlamp, I found the inflatable rollers tucked away under my deck, exactly where Juan said they'd be. They were massive, heavy vinyl sausages, and just wrestling them out from under the deck was a workout. My plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. I'd use my truck's powerful winch, a series of heavy-duty tow straps, and the now saturated muddy lawn as a slip and slide. Dave, drawn by the commotion, appeared on his porch, shining a flashlight that seemed to find its way directly into my eyes no matter where I moved. "Alex, what are you doing?" he shrieked. "Are you crazy?" "Probably, Dave," I yelled back, kicking one of the rollers into place under the boat's keel. "But I'm not drowning in my own house." He came out to help, which mostly consisted of him offering unhelpful advice. Don't drop it, and narrating my every move with escalating panic. "Oh God, it's tipping, it's tipping." Slowly, painstakingly, I used the winch to pull, the truck to nudge, and the rollers to guide the 3,000-pound boat across my award-winning St. Augustine grass, leaving 2 deep, muddy furrows in its wake. The noise was horrific, a chorus of groans from the trailer, squeals from the straps, and my own strained grunts. Finally, the stern of the Albatross was hanging over the edge of the canal. The water was now level with my lawn. With one final, heart-stopping lurch, the boat slid off the back of the trailer and into the churning water with a great, magnificent splash. It bobbed violently, but it was afloat, tethered to a dock, cleat by a rope that strained against the current. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. I did it. I actually did it. My lawn was a war zone, but my boat was in the water. I was free. I scrambled onto the dock, untied the line, and leaped aboard the heaving vessel. Fumbling with the keys, I jammed one into the ignition and gave it a turn. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life, a beautiful, throaty sound that was music over the howl of the wind. I was about to cast off, to aim the bow toward the open water of the intracoastal and leave Serenity Cove and Brenda Fromm in my wake forever. My hand was on the throttle when my phone, lying on the console, buzzed violently. Then it buzzed again, and again. It was a group text chain for our section of the neighborhood. I picked it up. The first message was from Mrs. Gable, 3 houses down. "Is anyone else's ground floor completely flooded? We have 2 feet of water in the living room. My kids are terrified." Then another from the Millers. "The water is coming in under our doors. We've moved everything upstairs, but I'm really scared." And another. And another. Panicked messages from my neighbors, all trapped, all watching the water rise. I killed the engine. The sound of the storm rushed back in, a terrifying wall of noise. I grabbed the powerful spotlight I'd installed and swept its beam across the neighborhood. It was a nightmare. The streets were gone, replaced by fast-moving rivers. Every house was a dark, isolated island. I swung the light to Dave's house. He was standing on his front porch, which was now a small pier, the water lapping at the welcome mat. He was waving his arms frantically. On a grim impulse, I panned the light further down the canal to Brenda Fromm's perfectly manicured 2-story palace. The ground floor was completely dark. The floodwater was already halfway up her prize-winning rose bushes, drowning them in a murky, swirling soup. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about my escape anymore. If I left now, I was leaving them all to fend for themselves. My boat, my ridiculous, half-finished project boat, wasn't just my escape route. In a neighborhood where every car was trapped on a rapidly shrinking patch of land, it might be the only escape route. I was no longer a guy trying to save his boat. I was a guy who might have to save his entire neighborhood. I looked out at the dark, open water of the Intracoastal, the gateway to safety. Then I looked back at the flooded, terrified houses of Serenity Cove. Faintly, over the wind, I could hear someone down the block calling for help. "Son of a..." I whispered into the storm. The panic that had seized me receded, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. Sitting here feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to help anyone. I needed a bigger boat. I needed professionals. I needed the cavalry. And there was only one way to call them. My eyes fell on the VHF marine radio mounted on the console. It was one of my proudest installations, a brand new top-of-the-line unit that I'd spent way too much money on. I'd never actually used it for anything other than listening to the Weather Channel, but I had watched at least a dozen YouTube tutorials by a grizzled old sailor named Salty Stan on proper radio protocol. I'd thought it was just for fun. Panic gives way to purpose. I flicked the switch for the boat's battery power, and the radio crackled to life with a comforting hiss of static. I took a deep breath, trying to channel Salty Stan's calm, no-nonsense demeanor. This wasn't a toy anymore. I switched the dial to channel 16, the universal hailing and distress frequency. My hand was shaking slightly as I keyed the microphone. I didn't just yell for help. I used the formal, precise language Stan had drilled into my head through my laptop speakers. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "This is civilian vessel the Albatross. Repeat, civilian vessel the Albatross." I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs. "We are located in the Serenity Cove residential canal system. I have a civilian emergency. We have a mass entrapment event. Repeat, mass entrapment." The static-filled silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then, a calm, professional voice cut through the noise, clear as a bell. "Receiving Mayday. This is United States Coast Guard Sector St. Petersburg. State your position, nature of distress, and number of persons on board." I I took another breath, reading the coordinates directly from my phone's GPS app. My position is latitude 27.7, longitude -82.6. The nature of distress is a failure of civil authority. An HOA official has locked the only vehicle exit, trapping approximately 50 to 60 residents inside a mandatory evacuation zone. I paused, letting that sink in. The entire development is now flooded due to hurricane storm surge. I am the only vessel currently in the water. My boat is the Albatross, one person on board, but I am requesting immediate assistance for the entire neighborhood. There was another pause, this one filled with what I could only assume was sheer, unadulterated disbelief. "Say again, your distress is a locked gate?" the voice on the radio asked, a hint of incredulity creeping in. This was the crucial moment. I had to make them understand. "Affirmative, Coast Guard," I said, keeping my tone level and factual. "A locked gate. The primary road access is completely flooded and impassable. The only way in or out of this neighborhood now is by water. We have families with children, we have elderly residents, all trapped in flooding homes." That did it. The absurdity of the locked gate was suddenly overshadowed by the reality of the situation. The tone on the radio shifted from confused to all business. "Understood, Albatross. A response boat has been diverted to your location. Maintain this channel. Can you give us a description of the waterway entrance from the intracoastal?" My heart leapt. They were coming. They were actually coming. I described the narrow entrance to our canal system, the one tucked between two larger waterfront properties. I stayed on the radio, my knuckles white on the microphone, as the minutes ticked by. I called Dave on my cell. "Get your family ready, help is on the way. And I mean real help." And then I heard it. It started as a low whine, a high-tech sound that cut through the storm's roar. It grew louder, resolving into the thrum of powerful twin diesel engines. A brilliant white searchlight sliced through the rain, sweeping across the water from the direction of the intracoastal. 3 minutes after my Mayday call, 3 minutes, I timed it, a boat appeared at the mouth of our canal. And it wasn't just any boat. It was a 45-foot Coast Guard response boat. A beast of a machine, all sharp angles and purposeful-looking equipment. Its blue and orange stripe a beacon of hope in the darkness. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The radio crackled again. "Albatross, this is Coast Guard vessel 4572. We are on station. The channel here is tight, and we're showing multiple submerged obstructions on our forward-looking sonar. Looks like mailboxes and lawn gnomes." A new voice came over the radio, female this time, radiating a calm authority that could pacify a riot. This had to be the commander. "Albatross, I see you on our thermal imager. You're smaller, more maneuverable. You know this area. I need you to act as our guide. Lead us to the most vulnerable residents. We will ferry them from their homes to our vessel for extraction. Can you do that?" I looked at my little boat, my half-sanded, jury-rigged project, its deck cluttered with tools. Then I looked at the military-grade vessel waiting patiently behind me, its crew ready, its engines humming, waiting for my command. They were asking me, the laid-off tech bro in a hoodie, to lead a United States Coast Guard rescue operation. I keyed the mic, my voice coming out as a slightly squeaky imitation of confidence. Affirmative, Coast Guard. Albatross is leading the way." I cleared my throat. "First stop is my neighbor Dave's place. He's having a bit of a meltdown. Follow me." I pushed the throttle forward. The Albatross's engine rumbled, and I began to navigate the surreal, submerged landscape of my own neighborhood. I carefully steered around Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning azalea bush, which was now a small, leafy island. Behind me, the massive Coast Guard boat followed like a loyal, heavily armed duckling. We pulled up to Dave's porch. 2 Coast Guardsmen in full tactical gear and helmets hopped out into the waist-deep water without hesitation and sloshed their way to him. They helped his terrified wife, his 2 kids, and finally a whimpering Dave himself into my boat. From there, they ferried them across the 20 feet of water to the big response boat, where other crew members helped them aboard. And so it began. One by one, I guided them from house to house, the Gables, the Millers, the elderly Mr. Fitzwilliam, who insisted on bringing his cat. I was a hero. I was a water taxi. I was the unlikely admiral of the world's most suburban fleet. After we'd rescued 4 families, the authoritative voice of Lieutenant Rostova crackled over the radio. "Excellent work, Albatross. Who's next on your list?" I swung my spotlight to the end of the canal, illuminating the largest house on the block, the 2-story beige palace. "One more, Lieutenant," I said into the mic. "The architect of this whole mess." I motored the Albatross slowly toward Brenda Fromm's house. The water was halfway up her ground-floor windows. Her perfectly manicured lawn, the source of so many threatening HOA newsletters, was now a swirling brown lake. And there, on her second-floor balcony, standing next to a tragically overturned Grecian-style planter, was Brenda herself. The wind had torn her ridiculous yellow slicker, and her hair was plastered to her head. The smugness was gone, replaced by a pale, raw look of terror. She looked small, wet, and utterly defeated. The tables had not just turned, they had been smashed into firewood and set ablaze. I let my boat drift until it was right below her balcony. I cut the engine and let the sound of the storm fill the space between us. Then I looked up at her, cupped my hands around my mouth, and yelled, "Brenda, need a lift?" I couldn't resist. The moment was too perfect. I checked the bylaws, and there's no specific rule against parking a boat on a submerged Corinthian column, so I think we're good. Her face, illuminated in the harsh glare of my spotlight, was a spectacular wreck of fury, humiliation, and desperation. If looks could kill, I'd have been vaporized on the spot. One of the young Coast Guardsmen, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20, was standing on my bow, ready to assist. He looked at me, then up at the sputtering woman on the balcony, then back at me, his expression one of pure, unadulterated bafflement. "Wait," he said, pointing. "That's the one who locked the gate?" "The very same," I said with a grim smile. Lieutenant Rostova's voice came over the radio, and it was dripping with ice. There was no protocol warmth in it now. It was the sound of the law about to come down hard. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying clearly from my radio's speaker. "This is Lieutenant Rostova of the United States Coast Guard. We need you to come down. We have some questions for you." Brenda had no choice. She was cornered by reality. 2 burly guardsmen waded to her front door, forced it open against the water pressure, and helped her out. They guided her through the flood waters of her own foyer and delivered her, soaking and shivering, to the side of my boat, the very vessel, the lawn ornament she so despised. A guardsman offered her a hand. She had to take it. She had to step from her ruined kingdom onto the deck of my half-finished boat. She sat, drenched and defeated, on a cooler in the stern, refusing to make eye contact. I gave the Coast Guard crew a crisp thumbs up, started my engine, and began to motor her back toward the main response boat, toward the flashing blue lights, toward justice. I couldn't help but whistle a cheerful tune. The next morning found us all in the cavernous, echoing gymnasium of a local high school, which had been converted into a Red Cross shelter. The air smelled of wet clothes, coffee, and disinfectant. People were huddled on cots, wrapped in gray blankets, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. I was a minor celebrity. People kept coming up to me, patting me on the back, calling me a hero. It was awkward and deeply weird. Dave was holding court in a corner, recounting the night's events to a rapt audience. His version already involved a 10-foot storm surge, shark-infested waters, and me single-handedly wrestling the boat off the trailer. I decided to let him have his moment. I was sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee when 2 familiar figures approached. It was Officers Miller and Davis. Their demeanor was different. The weary cynicism was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like respect. "Mr. Peterson," Miller began, calling me Alex now. "We need to take a formal statement, if you're up to it." He shifted his weight. "We've been, in communication with the district attorney's office. Lieutenant Rostova's report was very detailed." Officer Davis, the younger one, was failing to suppress a massive grin. "He means Brenda's in a world of hurt," he chimed in, leaning closer. "They're looking at a whole menu of charges. False imprisonment, reckless endangerment. The DA is loving it. And because she interfered with a federal agency during a declared disaster, they're even looking at federal charges. The FBI might want to talk to her." A slow, profound sense of satisfaction washed over me. I sat down with them at a folding table and calmly, factually, told them everything that had happened, from the first warning about my boat to Brenda's final defeated glare as she was led onto the Coast Guard vessel. It was the most satisfying statement I'd ever given. 2 weeks later, the water had receded, leaving behind a brown, stinking blanket of mud and debris. Serenity Cove looked like it had been put in a blender and spit out. The cleanup was a massive communal effort. Restoration crews were everywhere. The main gate was gone. Not just open, but physically removed from its hinges and lying on its side in the grass like a slain metal beast. I heard a rumor that some of the guys from the neighborhood had taken a cutting torch to it the day after the storm. No one seemed to be investigating. Juan and his crew were at my house, surveying the muddy trenches that scarred my lawn. He clapped me on the shoulder. "Don't worry about the bill for the lawn repair, man," he said with a grin. "Sod's on me. Call it the Admiral's discount. What you did, that was good stuff." Just then, Dave jogged over, holding a piece of paper like it was a summons. "Alex, you won't believe this. We had an emergency HOA meeting. Brenda's been recalled, obviously. Her lawyer is trying to sell her house in a hurry. They're nominating a new president." He stared at the paper in horror. "Someone nominated me." I burst out laughing, a real, genuine laugh. "President Dave," I said. "It has a nice ring to it." He looked at me, his face a mask of terror. "It's not funny, Alex. Do you know how much paperwork is involved?" 1 month later, the neighborhood was slowly coming back to life. President Dave's first and only act so far had been to pass a motion with unanimous support, permanently banning the installation of a front gate. My lawn was green again. More importantly, the Albatross was finished. I'd spent the last few weeks working feverishly, channeling all the chaos and adrenaline into the final details. The mahogany brightwork gleamed with 12 coats of varnish. The chrome shone. She was beautiful. I launched her properly this time, backing the trailer down a real boat ramp into the calm, blue waters of the intracoastal. I motored out into the main channel, the rebuilt engine humming a perfect, steady tune. I looked back at Serenity Cove. It was still a bit of a mess, but the scars were healing. It was home. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt a sense of belonging, a connection to the people I'd once thought of as just beige-clad annoyances. I wasn't just the weirdo with the boat anymore. I cracked open a cold beer from the cooler and took a long, satisfying sip. The sun was warm on my face. The water was sparkling. I was at peace. My gaze drifted to the small, inflatable dinghy I'd bought last week, which was tied to the stern, bobbing happily in our wake. I'd just finished stenciling a name on its side in neat black letters. The B. From. I took another sip of my beer and smiled. "To new beginnings," I said to no one as I sailed off into the sun,